Let me just read you a passage from one of my favourite ocean books, An Unnatural History of the Sea by Callum Roberts. Before 20th century industrial fishing took hold, European seas seethed with life. The British Isles sit amid a broad expanse of shallow continental shelf, stretching from Scandinavia far into the Atlantic. Every winter, storms mix nutrients from the seabed with surface water, so that in spring, when the days lengthen and sunshine warms the sea, there is an explosive plankton growth. This rich planktonic soup nourishes the immense schools of fish upon which the large predators fell in endless pursuit. The sight of a herring school being attacked from all sides must have inspired awe in those who witnessed it. The herring in blind panic career in swerving rushes as packs of dogfish and cod pick them off from the edge of the school. Fin whales break the surface with open mouths, spilling fish in streams of liquid flapping silver back into the sea. Lithe blue sharks dart above and below the whales, some lifted clear of the water as the whales raise their heads from the water, slithering from their flanks back into the sea. And porbeagles glide the shadows, cutting deep passages through the school far below. At the surface, confusion reigns as thousands of birds bob on the oily water, picking at the dead and dying, some flapping from the water to avoid being sucked into the maw of a whale. The staccato whoosh of attacking gannets, raining from above, cutting deep into the school, their passages marked by bubble trails, and the air thick with birds circling, swooping, and crying. Then there's expected calm, when the fight passes to another quarter, leaving dark water punctuated by thousands of mirror scales twinkling and turning as they sink beneath the oily surface.
Welcome to Ocean Unpacked, your one-stop shop to get the latest in ocean news and marine science, as well as some amazing facts about life under our seas. Greg, that was an incredible picture you painted. I was just closing my eyes and imagining all of the life bubbling out of the ocean just from kind of all this fish that was in the water.
Yeah, it's incredible. And it's just mad to think that's what UK seas used to be like, considering what the mindset is today, which is that, they're pretty empty and boring.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that's kind of what this episode is going to be about. We're going to be talking kind of about sustainable seafood, about how we consume seafood and how that's changed, and what decisions can we make in our everyday life to make sure that the seafood that we're eating isn't having a negative impact on the environment. So I think kind of before we dive into that, just to provide some context about actually how much seafood people eat nowadays, in these last couple of years, seafood production is up to almost 200 million tons. And that's from wild capture fisheries as well as aquaculture. And when we're talking about the average person, nowadays, the average person's eating about 21 kilos of seafood per year. And to put that into context, in the 1960s, that number was half. So in just the last 60 years, we have more than doubled our seafood consumption per person. And so, it really goes to show just how much this industry has grown and how much our consumption of seafood has grown as well.
Yeah, it's just crazy. And it just shows the change in sort of human behavior and sort of commercialism over the last 50 years or so. And it's massive change. But not only our demand has changed, and this means that the fishery industries has changed as well to try and keep up with this demand.
Yeah, and kind of like going back to that story you were talking about, about how like the seas were essentially bubbling with all this fish. I mean, that's obviously something that we don't see as much nowadays because kind of this massive growing demand has had to be met through a huge growth in the fishing industry as well. In the last couple of centuries, fishing vessels and the fishing gear we use have all developed massively so that we can catch more fish to keep up with this demand. And when we say catch more fish, that's also having to keep in mind that fish stocks and fish numbers have also been decreasing in the last few centuries, especially in the last few decades, at the same time that fishing vessels and fishing gear are developing. So, we're creating these more elaborate ways to catch fish with larger nets and longer lines, but still catching about the same amount that a little wooden ship with sails and a couple of nets thrown off the side of the boats would catch, a few centuries ago. So
Yeah. The changes really came in, sort of in the 50s, where we got more sort of steam engine or more powerful engines. They got refrigeration on ships, and this is where that massive change came in. Because before then, you were only, boats were only able to catch a certain amount. They had to return to shore every day or every few days to return the fresh fish. In the 50s, when refrigeration came in on ships, and also ships just, technology and the power of ships got bigger and bigger, it allowed those ships to stay out for much longer, to keep the fish fresh in these massive fridges, massive freezers on the boats. And so the amount of seafood we were catching absolutely skyrocketed. So in the 50s, we were catching about 20 million tons of fish every year, which is already a pretty huge number. But by the 90s, just 40 years later, we'd gone from 20 million to nearly 90 million tons every single year of this wild capture fisheries. And this was mainly due to these technological advances. But then, as you mentioned, since the 90s, even though technology by all means has continued to develop, and there is better technology to fish deeper, to fish further out to shore, we're seeing that the amount of fish caught, wild caught fish caught, is stayed roughly stable around that 90 million tons. And one of the main factors for this is that it's harder to catch that many fish nowadays.
Exactly, yeah. There's just less fish. It's, even though you have bigger nets, you're fishing for these kind of smaller schools and smaller groups of fish than, you were getting a few centuries ago. And, I think for a lot of people, it's hard to kind of visualize the scale that the fishing industry has kind of grown into now. Like, I think maybe a lot of people still think that we're just kind of dragging these small nets in the back of boats, scooping up fish. Again, like I feel like not a lot of people have a lot of exposure to see what that's like. I think about the first time that I maybe saw something like that was, let's say, like Finding Nemo. And this is a movie we keep coming back to. But, in that scene when they kind of have this tiny little fishing vessel with like two little fishermen, and then just dragging this net and catching and scooping up all this fish, that may have been the case maybe 100 years ago, or even further away, further before. But, now fishing vessels and fishing gear have just developed into these enormous machines. We're talking about trawlers that, whether that's kind of a bottom trawler or an open water trawler, that are these massive nets that, the mouth of the net can be as tall as the Eiffel Tower, as in you can literally swallow up the Eiffel Tower in these absolutely huge trawlers. You get long lines that now can stretch up to 100 kilometers and have these kind of tens of thousands of baited hooks just coming off this main line, catching, anything within that kind of 100-kilometer range. You have dredges, you have these purse seines and fish aggregation devices that make it easier to catch things like tuna. And, it's really, really changed the way that we're harvesting and exploiting the ocean. And it's also having an incredibly large negative impact on the marine environment.
But we should caveat that before we go any further, that we are really highlighting, the commercial fisheries, the huge nets and the huge ships. But that's not all fisheries. That only accounts for about 60% of all the capture fishery production around the world. About 40% of fishery capture around the world is caught by small-scale fisheries. That's, pole and line, that's smaller boats, hand-caught, jigging, small hand nets, those sorts of things, local fisheries, both locally around the UK, around developed nations, and around less developed nations. Mm-hmm. But these are the fisheries we're not so worried about. These are the fisheries that are generally supplying locally sourced food to local communities, and generally less damaging methods. And the other reason, that small scale fisheries, they're massively, massively important for protein for local communities, but also for employment. 90% of all of 90% of the fisheries employment is in small scale fisheries. So they employ a huge amount, and they're really important for the economy and for communities around the world. The problem is the scale that the commercial fishing industries is not only emptying our oceans, but also impacting the small scale fisheries. We're probably not going to have time today to talk about it.
Yeah,
but of
it's a very
course,
complex issue for sure.
the commercial fishing industries are generally going in and physically stealing the fish
Yeah.
from under the jaws of the small scale local fisheries,
Yeah.
which is, like I said, a massive problem we're not going to talk about today. But what we want to highlight is that small scale fisheries absolutely vital to economies, vital to communities, vital around the world. The problem is the commercial fisheries.
Yeah. And I think, before we even talk about what sustainable seafood mean, I think we have to just make very clear what unsustainable seafood is, what it means to have unsustainably caught or produced seafood. Now, with this huge development in fishing gear and the scale of fishing, there has been, or there is currently, massive environmental impacts to the oceans and to life in the oceans as well. And firstly, one of the most basic things is overfishing, essentially overexploitation of the fish that are currently in our oceans. When we look at there's a really great report by the Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO, from 2024 that looks at the change that the fishing industry and the aquaculture industry has experienced in the last few decades. And if we look at actual fish stocks that are overfished, that percentage increased in the last 50 years from 10% to now about 30%. So 30% of fish stocks are now overexploited. They're pushed to the absolute brink. And then the other kind of 50-60% of fish stocks, they're teetering at the edge, as in they are fished to their maximum sustainable yield. And then there's only a very small proportion that are underfished, that are actually underexploited. So we really are at the moment pushing fish stocks past that limit and causing numbers of fish to drop. I think that a lot of people will probably be most familiar with when we talk about the negative environmental impacts of commercial fisheries is bycatch. So the accidental catch of non-target species. So, for example, on a big pelagic trawler, so a big open ocean trawler, you're sweeping up and you're catching a lot of sardines, mackerel, anchovies. But you might also catch things that are feeding on them, things like dolphins, things like sharks, things like even whales with the scale of some of these nets. And then when you talk about long lines that have these baited hooks that are targeted at catching tuna, at catching sailfish and marlin, the baited hooks are also going to attract a lot of other animals like turtles, like sharks, and even seabirds. So the commercial industry is responsible for a huge amount of death of other important marine species that aren't even the targets of the actual fishery itself.
Yeah, and the interesting thing with bycatch, I think, as well, is these are the most popular animals in the ocean. If you talk to people about the ocean, everyone loves dolphins, everyone loves turtles. These are the charismatic animals that are in some places providing huge economic benefit through tourism.
Yeah.
And are billions of children's favorite animal as they grow up and all these things. But yet there's an activity that the vast majority of the population are doing, which is buying seafood, that is actually directly killing these animals that so many people see as their favorite animal. And it's just that disconnection that people don't realize what damage is happening.
And I remember it was a couple of months back. I don't know how long it's been now, but Blue Marine Foundation made a really good kind of short film, kind of look, just trying to visualize the amount of bycatch that comes with, let's say, a little cod steak on our plate, or a little steak of haddock on our plate, which both of these are typically caught from bottom trawling. And again, for people who don't really know what bottom trawling is, essentially it's a net that's dragged across the seafloor to catch things like Atlantic cod and things like haddock, but also then catching everything else that gets kicked up from the seafloor. And then in the same process, absolutely destroying the seafloor habitat that these nets are being dragged along. And so there's a really good, I think, and I definitely recommend everyone to check it out. It's this really, really great short film that shows someone ordering a little cod steak or a haddock steak. I can't remember which fish exactly, and then also getting all of the bycatch put on the table, and essentially it's just it's
Well,
just
it drops from
it
above
drops
him,
from the
doesn't
ceiling,
it?
yeah,
Drops from
and
the
it just
ceiling.
it just absolutely covers that. You can't even see the table anymore because it's just like it's all the other starfish, all the crustacean and the sea sponges and all these other smaller fish that get caught in it. So the issue is that when you do scale up with these fishing, to make fishing more efficient, to make sure that we're catching as much as possible with the few fish that are left in the oceans for a lot of these fisheries, you do end up catching other animals as bycatch, or end up destroying the habitats like the seafloor when you do bottom trawling or dredging.
Yeah, and this is, everything you've talked about, the overfishing and the bycatch, all of this is through reported and legal fishing, right? So the other massive issue that we have with the commercial fishing industries is what's called IUU, which is illegal, unreported, or unregulated fishing.
Yeah.
This is basically all of the illegal activity that goes on around the world. And as you can imagine, it being the ocean, there's not people all around, obviously on land, you've got people that have easy access to pretty much everywhere. Illegal activity, although it happens, is harder to hide.
Yeah.
When it happens out in the ocean, it's incredibly easy, relatively, to perform illegal activities.
Yeah.
And there's numerous different reasons for that. Partially all the laws around how boats are flagged. Ships can basically choose what country they want to be under, so they can choose countries that don't have very strong fishing laws or aren't going to follow it up anyway.
Or don't even have any coastline.
Exactly. Mongolia is one of the most commonly flagged countries in fishing vessels, which is just mad because it's a landlocked country.
Yeah,
right?
exactly, yeah.
And so and again, we're not going to have time to go into detail about this particular topic, but the illegal, unregulated, and unreported side of the fishing industries is an incredibly dark side of fishing, including a lot of evidence for labor abuses, human slavery, trafficking, all sorts of awful things that are happening within the fishing industry as well. So this huge industry, which is one of the biggest industries in the world, has a huge number of issues with it.
Yeah. And I think that's such a good point, because it's not, a lot of people do just focus on the environmental issues, but then you also then have the human rights issues associated with a lot of the seafood that is kind of bought and sold in markets and in supermarkets around the world. There's a really good book, I think we did mention in our first episode, called Outlaw Ocean, that if you want to learn more about kind of the issues with IUU fishing and the human rights issues with kind of the high seas and the fishing industry, that is an excellent book to read. So we'll put the link in the description of the episode.
Similarly, while we're on recommendations, obviously you already mentioned Blue Marine Foundation's campaign with the bycatch. Another brilliant, we've talked about trawling, another brilliant film that I would highly recommend everyone watch, which was released last year, was Ocean with David Attenborough.
Right, of course, yeah.
How could we not talk about this?
No,
This is one of the most powerful films that has been released. I would argue one of the most powerful ocean documentaries that has been released in history. And one of the most powerful moments, or if without doubt the most powerful moment that has resonated with millions and millions around the world, is this footage, this world first footage of a bottom trawler in action.
Yeah.
And it was the first time it's ever been filmed, and it was absolutely devastating, even for both of us who were very aware of exactly what happens there. To watch that was moving and devastating at the same time. So I'd highly recommend. It's on Disney Plus. I'd highly recommend, if you can watch it. If not, go to Blue Marine Foundation's website. You can see numerous different clips. You will be able to find that trawling clip because it was across social media for many months, because it was so powerful. So I'd highly recommend watching that, because that will shock you.
Yeah, and I think the most shocking thing about it is just the fact that, and I think even for a lot of people like me, like us, that knows what goes on when you use these kind of really destructive fishing gears, is that to be able to visualize it and see it, because normally it all happens underwater. You see the boat dragging the net on the surface, but you don't see what happens underwater. So this provides that. It was one of the first times it's ever been filmed, and I think the visualization of it, to see how destructive it is, I think it did have a really, really big impact, and just it really shows you just how destructive this bottom trawling can be. If you compare it to something we would do on land, like, could you imagine if we were trying to catch rabbits or red deer by just dragging a massive net through the forest and at the same time ripping up all the trees, catching all the birds and all the small mammals and the insects and, just everything in its path, leaving just a barren landscape in its wake. That would absolutely never ever fly. That would be shut down so fast, immediately. But that is what happens in the oceans, and it's just because we don't see it. So definitely do check out this Oceans by David Attenborough. It is a fantastic film.
Out of sight, out of mind is a very dangerous thing, really, and that's what the problem is with the ocean.
Yeah, definitely. So we've talked a lot about how the ocean, how seafood can be caught unsustainably, but when we talk about these, fishing gears and these different methods of catching wild fish, it's important to keep in mind that only makes up half of all seafood production in the world. So only about 95 million of seafood that is bought and sold and caught, bought and sold is from wild capture fisheries. The other half is from aquaculture. And this is also, it's a very complex topic that we could do a whole episode about it.
Yeah, maybe we will
by itself, and maybe we will. We might bring someone on to be able to who's a little bit more knowledgeable than either of us in actual aquaculture. But aquaculture is really, really important in the topic of sustainable seafood because when you look at it, it's a way to farm seafood, whether that's fish, crustacean, seaweed, bivalves like mollusks, like mussels and oysters. And it's a way to reduce pressure on the wild fish stocks and a way that we can then, meet our seafood demands while giving time for wild fish stocks to recover, to repopulate. And, on paper, it can seem like the silver bullet to the issue of overexploitation of wild fish stocks. But it's not quite that black and white.
No, it's not that simple. It definitely has its perk, but like any massive industry, it can be done right, and there's some great ways to do it, but it can be done wrong and have different but equally damaging impacts on the environment, on fish stocks. One of the main reasons that I always find it very ironic with aquaculture is that many of the fish species that are grown in aquaculture are carnivorous fish.
Yeah.
So these fish, by definition, need to eat other animals.
Other fish.
Pretty much other fish.
Yeah.
So where do they get those fish from? They go fishing. So for someone who is trying to avoid impacting the ocean by not buying wild caught fish, if you go and buy a carnivorous aquacultured fish, chances are that fish has still required fishing in the wild to grow it. And that stage, and we know this through the trophic levels, the higher up in the food chain an animal is, the less efficient it has been at gathering energy because it goes through different levels. So not only has this animal had to have fish captured to be fed it, you're getting less protein or less energy, you want to call it, than if you had eaten the original fish in the first place.
Yeah, I think a really good example is salmon. And I think salmon, when you think of aquaculture, I think a lot of people first think of salmon, like salmon farms.
Yeah.
You have them in all over Scotland, Norway, Canada. But just to give an example of what Greg was saying, to produce 1 ton of farmed salmon, it takes about 2.5 tons of wild caught fish in the fish feed that goes to feeding these salmon while they're growing. So that can mean that, 500 anchovies would have had to been caught and put into the fish meal to produce just 1 salmon. And I think this is one of the big criticisms about aquaculture, is that when we are producing these kind of these species that are high on the trophic level, high on the food chain, and that require, this kind of like oils and proteins from fish lower down the trophic levels to grow, we're getting a lot of that fish from the ocean. So, I think nowadays roughly about 80% of forage fisheries, so fisheries that fish for anchovies and sardines and these kind of small fish that feed on plankton, about 80% of the wild caught forage fisheries goes into feeding aquaculture, goes into aquaculture feed, goes into pet food, and then also goes into fish oil supplements. So, it's not so black and white that it's just like we've started farming fish. That means we're not taking any fish from the ocean anymore. But, it's obviously not that simple. And, you still have a lot of fish getting wild caught to be able to feed this growing industry of aquaculture. And, that's just one of the things. Disease and parasites is also a big one. Like, again, for salmon farming, sea lice is a huge problem. And there are some salmon farms around the world that, experience 70% of their fish that they're farmed in these pens, 70% of them dying and not even making it kind of out of the farm to be sold. So it can be really inefficient. It can be a huge waste of resources.
That I think is just mad. Imagine that in animal agriculture, as mad and cruel as animal agriculture is. Imagine 70% of the animals died before you could harvest them.
Imagine like a cattle in a cattle farm.
It just again, it wouldn't be continued because it just wouldn't make any sense.
Yeah.
But again, when people aren't aware of this, and this is there's plenty of evidence of these companies trying to avoid this being found out. Illegal dumping of all the dead animal, all sorts of bad stuff happening behind the scenes.
Yeah.
Sorry, I had to interrupt you there because I just think that's mad.
No, it's
70%.
I don't think that's it. I think that's why I think with aquaculture, it's not just the kind of like single solution to get sustainable seafood, because there are problems with it, and pollution that comes from it as well. Like, you are putting a lot of fish into a really, really enclosed pen, and the waste that they produce, whether these pens are in lakes or kind of in estuaries or offshore, a lot of the waste that they produce will leak into the surrounding environment if you have these kind of what we call open net pens, open net aquaculture farms. And that can have an impact on the surrounding environment. It can cause these algal blooms because of this input of excess nutrients. Disease can kind of go from these really cramped pens into the wild populations of fish around. So, there's definitely things that has to be considered when you do purchase seafood from aquaculture farms or from fish farms. But there definitely are a lot of methods and a lot of ways that fish farming is extremely sustainable.
Exactly. And one of the other big issues with aquaculture in certain aquaculture, such as shrimp farming, is the land or marine land that's needed. Shrimp farming is a huge example of this, that they need a very specific area. They obviously need these sort of shallow, water-covered flats, intertidal zones, exactly. And so when shrimp farming sort of took off in the last sort of 30 years or so to try and be maybe more sustainable, because shrimp fishing is famously unsustainable. It's that classic bottom trawling. It's that up to 90% bycatch. So it's relatively common knowledge, although not common enough, that shrimp fishing is incredibly unsustainable. But this caused an absolute boom of shrimp farming, which meant that there was an absolute devastating loss to mangroves, because mangroves thrive in that intertidal zone.
Yeah.
Shrimp farms needed that space, and they cleared the mangroves. And this has had this is the leading factor in mangrove loss around the world. So it's an absolute tangible problem that we need to address. So it's just there's numerous different areas, like we mentioned. There are caveats to aquaculture to ensure that it is sustainable. It can be done. It can be sustainable, and we can talk about what you need to look for in aquaculture and in general in fishing. But there is details. The problem is there's not just one. Like you said, there's not one silver bullet.
Yeah. And like you said, as soon as you scale something up into, an industrial level, it's going to be very difficult to contain these kind of negative environmental impacts. But there are ways.
And there is one particular one that both of us, I think, are particularly keen on, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that is seafood like bivalves, like mussels and oysters, that come out of aquaculture farms. So we talked a lot about salmon and how it's like this carnivorous fish that requires a lot of energy to go in. Now, mussels and oysters, they don't need any feed, and they even have a net positive impact on the marine environment when they're farmed. So, for example, oysters, they're farmed on ropes. You kind of just have these ropes dangling in the estuaries, or whether that's offshore on a lake, And then you release the kind of oyster eggs around these ropes. They'll settle on the ropes and they'll start to grow. And oysters, as well as mussels, they filter feed. So they actually filter out a lot of the sediment. They filter out a lot of the excess nutrients in the marine environment that they're growing in. And they help to improve water quality, and even the carbon that they use to build their shells. That is also taken from the water, and then that allows the water to then absorb more carbon. So, I think it's one of those rare, like aquaculture products that by consuming it, you are actually having a positive impact on the environment. So, definitely that is one of the stars of aquaculture.
Go shellfish.
Shellfish.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No.
That's definitely the gold standard, right? If the most sustainable, without doubt, seafood you can eat is aquacultured mussels and oysters done the right way, because like Julia said, they have a net positive. Of course, there are other still positive, although not as brilliant options for aquaculture. The main things you want to be thinking about if you are still looking at fish, wanting to buy fish that is aquaculture fish, you want to be looking for herbivorous fish. Tilapia and carp are probably the two most commonly farmed vegetarian fish, basically. And the reason for that is that they don't require this fish meal that's high in protein from mainly, or some animal products, mainly fish. So we've got tilapia, carp that are nice, low impact, generally can be reared in relatively good locations as well.
Yeah.
Waste isn't such a big issue, although obviously all of these areas, they still need to be considered, which is why it's not a simple answer.
Yeah.
And one of the other ways, or the other things we want to look for when we're thinking about purchasing seafood from aquaculture, is the system it's in.
Yeah.
You mentioned about the waste, and any time that the systems are in the natural environment, there's a chance that it will destabilize the environment, whether it's through waste, whether it's through escapees.
Yeah.
And so what we want to be looking for, again, which is a great option but expensive, is these fancy terms, this recirculating aquaculture systems, or closed loop systems, basically where everything is contained. It could be in a building somewhere, all the water's contained, it's all filtered, and they grow everything in a completely controlled environment. Now, we're not going to go on to the moral discussions of keeping fish in these containers, because it's not a particularly good life for them. But if we're looking purely at the environmental impact, then these closed loop systems are definitely a much safer option for the environment.
And they're definitely being a lot more common, especially again for salmon farming. So obviously we've been talking about these open net salmon farms, and we're not trying to say that all salmon that you buy or all salmon that is farmed is terrible, because now you are having a lot of salmon that is farmed in these kind of closed systems where the water is recycled, the waste is collected and disposed of properly, and none of these salmon are escaping into the wild because it's a closed system. So aquaculture definitely, I do, in my personal opinion, I do believe aquaculture is one of the main solutions that we have against the overexploitation of wild fish stock. So I do think aquaculture can, if done right, can have an incredible impact. And we are seeing there's a lot of investment going into it. I think actually 2025 was the first year where aquaculture produced more seafood than
so 2024 report, the FAO report. Which is exciting, and that's, again, it's hopeful that we can reduce our impact on the oceans, but the aquaculture being done needs to be done right.
Exactly, yeah. So if you ever do buy salmon, just make sure you know where it's coming from, especially what kind of aquaculture farm it's coming from.
All right, so we've covered aquaculture now as why that's So we've covered aquaculture now and sort of the caveats of what to look for with aquaculture. What about generally buying sustainable seafood?
Yeah.
What can we look for?
Yeah, and of course, I mean, that's something we've been talking about. So we're talking about, like, making sure you pick and choose which seafood you're buying, and making sure that that's sustainable, knowing which farm it comes from, or knowing what gear is used, whether, it's like pole and line for tuna versus purse seines and fish aggregation devices. And one of the most common ways that we can look out for this is from certifications. So one of the most well-known certifications for sustainable seafood is the Marine Stewardship Council, MSC. So their label is essentially like this little blue tick with a fish logo. If you look for your salmon fillets or your cod or haddock or your tuna, tins of tuna, tins of sardines, if you can find this kind of certification, that is an indication that this seafood is or is more sustainable because it has been kind of assessed by this certification body to be sustainable. And obviously they're not the only ones. There's also Aquaculture Stewardship Council, ASC. Now they focus specifically on aquaculture, like salmon farms, like shrimp farms. You have BAP, Best Aquaculture Practices. You have Friends of the Sea. So there's a lot of different certifications out there that can help to guide you to make these sustainable seafood choices. But again, just like with aquaculture, it's not so black and white. So very often with these certifications, like MSC, with the Marine Stewardship Council, although you might buy a can of tuna that is MSC certified, it doesn't necessarily mean that this tuna, in the way it was caught, has had zero impact on the environment. Very often these certifications assess specific fisheries. Let's say a tuna fishery in Australia that catches tunas with pollen line. And the certification has essentially looked at this fishery and said, okay, they're not having a lot of bycatch. They're maybe every year catching 10 or 15 sharks, maybe a couple of seabirds. And because they're using pollen line, they're not really having that big of an impact on the habitat because you're not dragging a net across the ocean floor. So in that case, that can be a sustainable seafood source. But for a lot of these certifications or a lot of these fisheries, these limits in the amount of bycatch they can have before they lose their sustainable certification can be quite high. And just to take Marine Stewardship Council as an example again, because they are the largest sustainable seafood certification body, they still certify 43 bottom trawling fisheries. They still certify 46 longline fisheries as a sustainable fishery, despite these two specific fishing gears having notoriously high environmental impacts through bycatch and through habitat destruction. So again, it's not so black and white. The certifications are definitely a guide into choosing more sustainable seafood, but something we always do encourage is kind of doing that extra little bit of research, because for organizations like the Marine Stewardship Council, you can go on their website and you can literally look up every fishery that they've ever certified, and you can find out, what is their catch composition, how much of other species are they catching? Are they catching hundreds of sharks or no sharks or a few sharks every year? And that can help to guide your decision as well.
But let's be honest, how many people are going to think about buying a fish and stop, go and research the MSC website, go and find that specific fishery, go and find the bycatch and work out the bycatch, right? So
it's probably just me.
Yes, exactly. The nerds like Julian, by all means, go for that. Because that, by all means, that is the best way to do it. And that's in an ideal world, everyone would be making that extra effort to know exactly what the impact is. But it's not realistic on a day-to-day basis. So let's quickly cover, including certifications, let's quickly cover what are the main things that people want to look for that they can relatively quickly work out or judge that the seafood they are eating or wanting to buy is the more sustainable choice. And we don't need to go into perfectly sustainable. Of course, we mentioned earlier that the demand for seafood has skyrocketed in the last few decades. 20 kilos on average per person per year is just too much. So on average, we need to be reducing our seafood demand. So that's the first thing we can do is just eat slightly less seafood, whether it's cutting it out one less time a week or going Fish Free February, which is a organization that I'm a ambassador for, where you give up fish for a whole month and maybe some other months in the year or other weeks. So reducing our seafood demand is the number one thing we can do. But if we still want to eat seafood, what are some of the main things we can do to reduce the impact of it?
Yeah, I mean, it's like one of the easiest ways to do it is eating lower on the food chain. So eating things like mussels and oysters that have a net positive effect. Eating. There's a lot of seaweed's the new big thing now.
Oh yeah,
seaweed. I mean, you got lots and lots of foods that are now supplemented with seaweed. I think a fantastic example, and one that I'm only going to touch on very, very quickly because, again, a very, very complex issue. But a lot of the fish oil supplements that we're now seeing kind of on the shelves nowadays are coming from krill fishing. And so, krill is almost exclusively fished in South Antarctic waters, but again, having a quite a significant impact on the marine environment there. And you might think, krill, isn't that the little tiny little crustaceans that are literally everywhere? And that's true. It is definitely a very abundant fishery, but the way that it's being fished at the moment, it's very concentrated in a specific area of the Antarctic. And that is then having an impact on the other animals that predate on krill, like whales, like penguins, and all these other animals. So, for example, seaweed provides a very good alternative for omega-3s. So, again, going back to that eating low on the food chain, if you are ever buying fish oil, kind of omega-3 supplements or foods enriched with omega-3s, try to look for seaweed instead of krill.
Absolutely. And then we've got as Julian explained, we've got the well-managed fisheries and certification. So of course, yes, looking for that can be a first step along with choosing the species. Another thing to look for is how it's caught. We've mentioned numerous times the method of catch is so important.
Yeah.
So you want to be looking for keywords like pole and line, hand line, traps and pots, hand caught. You want to be looking to avoid things like bottom trawled, purse seine, long line. Have we got any others? Well, dredged is
scallop dredging. Oh, God.
Definitely out. Yeah. So, looking for those methods. And, if you have time to do a bit more research just on fishing methods alone, that can be your primary driving factor for choosing seafood.
And actually a very easy way to kind of get that information is instead of buying, and obviously this is a luxury because it tends to be more expensive, but buying from like your local fishmonger or, they tend to be able to give you a lot more information. Very often a lot of that fish isn't imported from far, far away waters because they're not packaged, so they have to be fresh. So generally they're caught quite locally. So, going to your fishmonger and buying fish that's only caught in the UK, then asking them, how is this fish caught? And again, just going for that kind of small scale fishery gears that tend to be more sustainable and have a much lower impact on the environment. And then, of course, if you are eating aquaculture sourced seafood, just making sure that you're also looking for that certification and try to purchase aquaculture seafood that is low on the food chain, like, again, mussels.
So
this is actually, this entire episode has just been an ad
mussel advert
for mussels and oysters. But then also things like tilapia. So, that's kind of what are the main things to look out for if you do want to have a much more sustainable impact when you're consuming seafood.
Amazing. I hope that gives you a bit of a better idea as to reducing our environmental impact when eating seafood. We will be doing an episode probably diving more into the krill because that is a massive topic that we really would love to get a specialist on for. Similarly, for aquaculture, I think we can dive into that in a lot more detail as well in the future. But for now, hopefully that gives you a really quick summary of the seafood industry and what to avoid and what to look out for.
Thanks, everyone.
Next time.
Catch you in the next episode.